evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to this at-home National Arts Club event. We welcome James Van Kempler on behalf of the Arts Club from Kohn Pedersen Fox Architects to discuss One Vanderbilt. Little history about the club. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we're a true 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with the mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts. Annually, the club offers more than 150 free programs to the public, including exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures, and readings. For more information about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. The galleries are open to the public 7 days a week. On behalf of our architecture committee, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this program. Following will be the conversation with a brief Q&A, so please feel free to use the Q&A function for any questions you might have. And now to introduce our program. Please. All right. One Vanderbilt, Midtown's newest and tallest office tower, is linked at grade and underground to Grand Central Terminal. The facade of this 93-story tower is intended to harmonize with the Grand Central Terminal immediately to the east. The building's base is articulated as a series of diagonals, and the tower tapers as it rises, culminating in a pinnacle formed by 4 converging volumes. James Van Kempler, FAIA, RIBA, is president and design principal at Kohn Pedersen Fox, with a staff of over 750 architects and 9 global offices. Jamie has led the design of projects of many uses and scales, from city plans to towers to academic buildings. His work focuses on promoting social connections through creating shared spaces. He has explored these themes through his teaching at Klemperer, and I would further like to thank him very much for agreeing to do this program, not knowing where he would be, and he is in Munich this evening. With that, James, please take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you everybody in the committee and the group for inviting me to speak tonight. Indeed, I am in Munich, a great city of beautiful gardens, great royal boulevards, and neoclassical architecture. But nothing like New York. So let me just share screen for a second so we can go into images. Thanks, everybody. And so I do want to tell the story of the design of a building which has just been completed next to Grand Central Terminal. And the subscript in this title here about the connective skyscraper is meant to highlight the issue that high-rise buildings are often not very good urban neighbors, or don't often make such connective tissue. They're so dense in their occupancy of space, of floor area ratios, density going up to 30, which is the density of Vanderbilt, of the site area multiplied up, that they don't always allow for the kind of passageways of pedestrian life or mixed uses or street presence that we all believe really important, especially in the key sites in which high-rises usually find themselves. So let me just begin by showing you an image of this building, which sits sort of at the intersection between what I think of as the belt and the spine of Manhattan. For those of you who haven't been to Grand Central Terminal recently, on 42nd Street and Madison Avenue, and of course Vanderbilt Place to the east. So really a kind of marker of the middle and the tallest office building in Midtown. But I want to pull ourselves back for a second to think about the planning and the history of Manhattan. This is very much a New York building, Vanderbilt Tower. And in the Dutch city, this kind of scramble of a variety of more medieval pattern orientation of small streets and spaces, of course, gave way. This was 1672, but gave way eventually to the influence, now somewhat fully realized, of the Commissioner's Plan of 1811. Those who remember the great exhibit up at the Museum of the City of New York about the history of the grid But essentially, there was a way to almost commoditize land and allow for clear pathways and logical, rational building of structures and eventually application of zoning. But the grid did not necessarily point to or find places of focus and connections, kind of a uniform pattern. And so if we now look at Manhattan as it has evolved, the yellow-orange bits are those places where we find larger open spaces, of course, super important for the health of the city and the connections that we make with each other. Central Park naturally, but also Gramercy Park, not a small and certainly not an insignificant piece of the puzzle. And so I want to talk a little bit about connections, spaces that connect buildings that look across or relate through open space. But also in this next map, the red bits here are cluster buildings, sites where the grid of Manhattan was kind of interrupted by an aggregation of buildings. For example, Lincoln Center, Rockefeller Center, the New World Trade Center areas. So these are very, very important incidents in cities, in grid cities, where exceptional moments for the functioning of transport, culture, of education can happen, and they enrich the grid. And the Vanderbilt Tower very much relies on and takes advantage of this strategy. So again, Gramercy Park, by omitting some throughway of Lexington Avenue, by in a way violating the grid, something great happens. The original work of Samuel Ruggles to bring this idea of sort of stakeholders from around the park to make a place. Indeed, here's where we all are or would be if this lecture were not virtual, in the Tilden House, and we see the depiction of crowds. So changing the grid can give us places for public and private to kind of interplay and relate to each other, and the presence of arts clubs, of not just the National Arts Club, but the Players Club or Sullivan Bundy Club, fitting for this kind of highlighting moment in the city of Gramercy Park. So a map thereof, done in 1930, showing the kind of the play allowed for, at least for those who had the key, little children showing up on the side, almost post-Victorian representation of the park. And then this is actually a picture of my mother's family. My mother spent her high school years living on Gramercy Park, and there she and a bunch of friends, some of them from Palmer family, looking out a little bit like that cartoon map that we just looked at. So no doubt she spent some time at the National Arts Club. But looking now at the map of New York on the left, and seeing that in that left map, we see Madison Square, and at that point, the sort of dotted rectangle to the northeast of Madison Square was a place where the first rail lines of New York City came into Manhattan, and eventually, of course, migrated up to Grand Central, where we know it sits today on 42nd Street. So the site of One Vanderbilt, and the first Madison Square adjacent park, railway corner or railway building here lasted 41 years. But then the importance of Grand Central as a place where a number of blocks were appropriated. And at this stage of these two buildings, the second one lasting only a little more than 10 years, rail came in above ground. Of course, afterwards, steam engines gave way to electric. They were able to be submerged, and over time, this plan was hatched for Terminal City. A lot of it not accomplished, but the Warren and Wetmore building was built in 1913. And this is really creating the premise for the site and the reason for the building, and its various sort of extroverted features that constitute the One Vanderbilt Tower. So later on, as we look into the kind of way in which one can dissect Grand Central, we see it as not just an operation to change the plan of this part of New York City. It's also a great sectional feat of bringing interesting vertical terracing and layering into one of the more complex buildings. Of course, the tracks go underneath, sweep around. Underneath, you see the curve on the right-hand side being part of the Vanderbilt site. And we think of the kind of almost delirious imagery of Moses King in his depiction of New York as he would imagine it, as a place where everything could be connected by bridge, by multi-level walkways, by tunnels, etc. And some part of this still remains as an ambition which high-rise buildings can try to achieve. The lower Grand Central Terminal certainly did a lot to look at this possibility. After the realization of Grand Central, since that time, we've seen a number of ideas about densifying this station district right on top of the station. Reed and Stem submitted this around 1911 at the same time as Warren and Wetmore's work. It was not taken up, and nor were some of the later ideas that came decades afterwards, including very notably I.M. Pei's sort of hyperbolic form of net cables that was imagined as a super tall building on top of Grand Central. The idea always being that density makes sense on top of a station, because the place where we can draw most New Yorkers to come in easily, conveniently, and today with a low carbon footprint should be the place where we provide the most space of either living or working or culture. But these ideas did not come to pass. So when we came to the site, which was about 10 years ago now, you see a question mark of an acre of land, which had been assembled by S.L. Green, who are the major landlords of much of this part of Manhattan. I think the largest commercial owners of property at the time this was started, and close to it at this point. So the combining of a tower with a station, again, seems right and smart from the point of view of a sustainable approach to density. It's also, in a compositional and pictorial sense, something that reminds us of other combinations of tall and central, of the St. Mark's Basilica in Venice and the Campanile, which is not such a functional building, but still a marker of space next to this, in a way, the center of town. Of course, a religious building. Actually, the Campanile fell down in, I think, sometime in before the First World War, for I'm not sure what reason, but was resurrected. Not everybody remembers that or knows it when they go to site, but anyway, this sort of interesting coming together of a tall building with a central kind of distributor function in the city. So that kind of combination, that confluence, is something that makes up a very important part of the firm in which I work, Kohn Pedersen Fox, because we have been applying our trade as high-rise architects, but often at the point of multimodal transit centers and mixed-use developments of all sorts of interesting vertical connections. So here in Seoul is a 123-story building that I designed some 15 years ago, the Lotte Tower, and you can see here a section that might not be as kind of radical as Grand Central Terminal, but actually has more in the way of interesting functions, including a concert hall for 2,000 people on the 8th floor. But it does kind of bring this technique of vertical mixed use into the place where this collection of building elements becomes an engine of commerce for the city. Another version, I'll show you a few of these in our work, and also one of my projects, the Jing'an Kerry Center, and a very kind of well-traveled part of Shanghai. And it is bringing together composition of office and hotel and residential and retail and conference on top of a transit connection. And what's most important about it, a little bit like Rockefeller Center, is the public space made inside this this collection of uses. And so the high-rise building is very much really, as it's true of the old RCA building, now Comcast building, it is really a place more than it is an object. And in that place stands a house where Chairman Mao lived as a young man in the early 20s. So there's also cultural significance to the place. And I think finally in this series, before we come back to Vanderbilt, is a sort of a super concatenation of functions in a building which stands above the Shinkansen rail in Nagoya in Japan, and a project done for Japan Rail. And it's really a city of functions sitting atop the hub of the main backbone of transport of Japan. So now we come to Vanderbilt, and the premise here is that a building of again, high density and great height, we could say does what it does most importantly at the base. I'll just sort of squeeze this to a larger scale, even though the resolution is not so good, but to show you that the idea is that the building would open itself up with a series of escalators, a series of shared spaces, and ultimately connect underground to Grand Central Terminal, and do so going down not only to the main concourse level, and where we know the trains that lead to Westchester and Connecticut and the subway lines, but also down to these holes, which were bored probably beginning around 2012, that allow for east side access, which is going to open very soon. These are now not raw holes that look like channel borings, but they're finished subway lines that lead to connect Long Island Railroad to Grand Central for the first time. So the importance of what is happening and will happen here is really a great kind of short circuiting what otherwise is a longer route for many New Yorkers. And it's in that escalator that goes way down to east side access, obviating or it's relieving a problem that will occur otherwise, which is that if we can see here, and this is a series of dots on a page to show that the peak load of rail travel when east side access opens will double the ridership of the rail part of Grand Central's user group. And so that would have caused failure on some of the stairs and escalators in terms of the way we rate transport use. And so what happens in this building is that we create, going back to this image, kind of a bypass to bring people out of east side access and out from the concourse level of Grand Central directly into train halls inside of One Vanderbilt, one train hall in particular. It also, the building answers an initiative that was launched by Amanda Burden under Mayor Bloomberg and Edith Suchen, who was the director of Manhattan Planning, to bring more lively world-leading businesses to the East Midtown district. There were a good proportion of the buildings in the East Midtown were not functioning well, had low ceilings, bad floor-to-floor heights, mechanical systems that didn't deliver proper fresh air, wall systems, exterior curtain walls that were not environmentally efficient. And so the idea was to spur some growth in selected spots by allowing for higher zoning density. And the Vanderbilt Tower served as a kind of pilot project, a little bit more complicated story. I may not have time to go into so much, but this was the first building in a process of getting the East Midtown zoning approved. And so it was very important in really influencing a larger district. So here you see the site, which Mark Holliday, Andrew Mathias, and others at SL Green worked to assemble over about 10 years. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 slivers of land. And they then came to us. The first sort of notice we had about the project to do a summer of studies of building, and it's our method as an architecture firm to think of building form and building solutions in a kind of iterative, explorative fashion to try a number of ideas before we settle on what we think is the most convincing and beneficial way of treating the site. And this also allows us to communicate well with the developer, owner, and other stakeholders who can bring intelligence to the process. So at this point, the project actually went into a more formal competition mode. A few other architecture firms, colleagues in the field here in New York competed for the project. And then we sort of focused a little bit more closely in on a couple of solutions, a taper and a setback building. And so these were my early sketch drawings of the building, showing that the taper we thought had the most power and the most effective strategy to treat the site and deliver space of office space inside the building, but also a lot having to do with the public realm at the base that was afforded by a composition of diagonals. So that single tapered form gave way in the next drawing sketch to a combination of two nested forms. And that then went further in these sketches, where I was looking at 1, 2, 3, 4. The reasons for the 4 having to do both with the proportions that become more slender in appearance, but also there are various issues that have to do with the structure of the building that are improved by having wind currents treated by indented corners in a way that confuses, as structural engineers will sometimes say, the wind forces that otherwise could gang up in a harmonic motion to actually sway the building. So that number 4 is where we ended up in the initial competition phase. And then this was my sketch from Bryant Park. Building's changed a bit since, but fundamentally it's a similar strategy. Our office, by the way, is right on the sort of lower left-hand side on 42nd Street. So this is a little bit of a home of the firm in which we work and also of the site. There's a competition team of colleagues looking at this from every point of view, some more from the sort of planning, the structure point of view, an urban planner sitting in the middle, Jen Pear, data analyst Luke Wilson on one side, Trent Tesh, my colleague at the end, Gene Kohn, who founded our firm, in the middle. And this is a pile of stuff that we generated in a very short time with a great deal of energy to try to solve a problem and bring our client, SL Green, into an appreciation and understanding of this set of ideas. So the taper is not exactly a setback, but setbacks can, as they become really super multiple, can approximate a taper. And so in these Hugh Ferris drawings, you can see the ideas that grabbed the architectural and planning community in the early 20th century. And you can see KPF's data analysts sort of mapping of different structural and planning ideas, which then were analyzed. A little hard to tell from this. I have to give another lecture to talk about it. But suffice to say, there's a lot of intelligence in the work which our data team does to understand how, for example, indirect light can come to the street. And that figured greatly in our discussions with city planning. The sort of formal composition of the building, there's these 4 nested volumes I mentioned, have a kind of a spiral relationship with each other. They are not symmetrically disposed clearly along north, south, east, west axis. They overlap in a way like the petals of a flower or the leaves of a sheaf of a stalk of some plant. There's something more organic about this composition, which we felt in many ways really made sense next to the supersymmetrical, grounded, and sort of absolute plan of Grand Central Terminal. And here you can see a little bit what I'm talking about in the relationship between tower the Campanile and the station, the Basilica below, and you see that cut at the bottom of the building, a kind of diagonal inclination of some soffits at the base of the building, which are expressive spaces that one can approach on the street that, if you will, gesture towards Grand Central. So the closed box of the terminal is complemented or answered with the openness of what we view as a kind of lantern like piece of the architecture at the base of the tower. And so thinking about diagonal composition, and as architects, we pick up a pencil, but we don't think only about what's on our paper and in a void. We're always searching for ideas and sensibilities that come from other sources, in this case, from the Ocean Park series of paintings, maybe of Richard Diebenkorn, or for those of you who know George Rickey's work, the kinetic needles of stainless steel that he brought to many college campuses and public settings. So the beauty of the attenuated form and the diagonal was something that became a theme for the project. It informed that space I mentioned earlier of the uplift of the base pointing towards the terminal building. You see, of course, Pan Am, GE, or MetLife rather in the background. And eventually there is rising now the Norman Foster building for JP Morgan Chase at the end of this Vanderbilt Avenue. And here, a sort of before and after image. The inclination, not just its section, but a slight pulling back in the plan of the base, allowed us to see from the 42nd Street and Madison Avenue intersection a lot more of the terminal, and not just because the building pulls back, but then the glass atrium-like space at the base of the building, made of very low iron, high transparency glass, reveals a lot of the Warren and Wetmore building, even past that line. So a part of that building, which has been hidden for over 100 years, is now revealed. And this was a really important part of, I think, appreciating a landmark and making sense of and celebrating what it has to offer as one of Manhattan's great buildings. Then another aspect of the echoing of surrounding, the sensitivity to neighboring buildings is the texture of the facade of Vanderbilt. We were determined not to make this a glassy object with little relief. And so looking at some of the window compositions and spandrels, other surfaces in the surrounding buildings made of brick, stone, stamped copper, metal, terracotta, we brought into the spandrel of our building, all the way up the building on the right-hand side, the terracotta of diagonals made in upstate New York and Buffalo, and the terracotta we know of Guastavino, which we find in St. John the Divine and under the 59th Street Bridge. But here in Grand Central, Oyster Bar, the work of this great Catalan inventor, engineer, and manufacturer, producer of tile work, of terracotta. And so the connection that's made below grade, which is terribly important for this building, it really view it as a public building rather than just as a place of work. It is a great office building, but maybe even more important, that function of relieving the pressure and circulation from Grand Central. And over on the right-hand side is a train hall, a transit hall, which is open 24 hours. And though private property, it's really a piece of the public good. It is, as we would think of it, a piece of Grand Central Terminal. It's Grand Central West, I would say. And also in the equation of the density of the building, there was a deal made between the developer and the city of New York and the transit, the various different transit organizations to get another 50% more area in the building for the tying in of the space and for a grant, which then the developer gave to the city of $220 million to improve the platforms of the transit, particularly the subway, improved various other connections, and the plaza, which was a kind of a dingy street, now closed for public use. It's a small area, but the kind of a tipping point in a way that brings you into Manhattan, the doorstep to Manhattan, at the end of the Kitty Kelly ramp of Grand Central Terminal. So, after this kind of period of investigation, of competition, of refinement of an early design, we reached the point of groundbreaking. So a developer there with our team, Jeff Kennel, Gene Kohn, again, our founder and a great urbanist. And this excavation, which was kind of a major piece of work, I think one of the largest, if not the largest, pour of concrete in the history of Manhattan, given the importance of establishing enough mass to counteract any overturning moments of the building and also to absorb its gravity loads. And so you could see this tremendous effort of concrete being poured into the cavernous hole below. And then you see the structure, which Ed DiPaola of Severud, a very gifted engineer, old-fashioned in a way. I don't think he carries a slide rule, but he actually punches a calculator from time to time. But a brilliant engineer who looked at the ways in which the forces of this tall tower could come down, but with a certain amount of cantilevering and leaning columns, could allow for this open space at the base, an open form behind the facades of the terrace to, as I mentioned, really gesture towards Grand Central. And as the structure moved up, the steel structure, it was what is known as a steel first building. That means that the concrete core did not become a sort of tree trunk around which, in sequence, the steel was welded and bolted, but rather the steel was the form which allowed this Italian machine known as a Perry form to slip form the concrete. So it was a bit innovative, and Tishman, the contractor, did deliver the building during COVID, under budget, and ahead of schedule. It was a remarkably, you could say, fortunate or skillful effort, or the effort of determined builders, which was really awesome. None of us thought this could happen in the middle of COVID, but it did. And so at the very topping out of the building, you can see those two steel workers on the right-hand side, clipped in somehow, but brave enough to take a selfie, looking down on the very top of the point pinnacle. So it's actually a hollow form, so they could crawl down it somehow. So at the topping out, the structure was done, and then the cladding came to in the form of these prefabricated panels. Here you see these are what we call the spandrels, the horizontal piece of the facade that covers the slab, that covers the drop ceilings. And terracotta is a very interesting extruded clay material that's fired. Again, Guastavino did his tile. It wasn't this type of modern extruded form of the material, which has become very sophisticated over time, but also has a beautiful sort of luster to it. And for SL Green to put their faith and their investment into a material that I would say is this noble and beautiful and sort of giving us a sense of the importance of the city we live in, that architecture should give back, that was paid for in the spandrels that went all the way up the building. Could easily have been some pressed metal, but there was a kind of a visual and even more some other kind of value given to buildings by their materials. And we can see the added richness of a certain amount of finer outrigger filigrees that are cladding the very base of the building, where next to our neighbors, it was important, we felt, not to, again, be classed with the glass boxes that we find frequently around the city. We wanted to class ourselves more with the Bowery Savings Bank, with the Chrysler Building, and others. So here, looking at some stone in the lobby. The interior public spaces were in with my colleague Nick Dunn, very important. And you can see that sort of lantern-like space functioning as a backdrop to a public space of what I call the tipping point of public plaza that was designed by Peter Walker, the landscape architect who also designed the space of the garden and park at the World Trade Center, along with Michael Arad. And but this glowing box with its soffits that are somewhat reminiscent of the Guastavino material, and an effort to keep the glass as kind of visually permeable as possible to invite your view as you come up the ramp and enter Manhattan. It's a great proportion of New Yorkers coming to work every day and otherwise have this view. Inside the lobby is not only a good deal of diagonally veined, again, the diagonal in the theme of the composition of the building, the diagonal in the terracotta, the diagonal in the top pinnacles of the building, but also in the veining as it was chosen of the marble. And you see this piece of bronze art, a series of flecks, which are almost a kind of maelstrom of diagonal lines. You can see here directly in elevation. This is a piece of art that was composed and crafted and detailed and strategized by our team of architects. So architects used to be figural artists in the medieval period and the Renaissance, and we don't pretend to be that distinguished, but the possibility to bring your idea as an architect into the detail of the building, we thought really wonderful, and something that was executed beautifully by a foundry on the Hudson. And so here we can see through to that lobby. We also see the public space between the kind of baths of Caracalla stone box of Grand Central on the right, and that densest of buildings of this tall tower visually lifted up to inflect towards Grand Central Terminal. And inside that corner is a Daniel Boulud restaurant, the Pavillon, which is worth trying someday if you haven't, for a special occasion. And then the warmth of the terracotta kind of being shed on the plaza out front. And then on the third floor, just about through, is a terrace, which, although again a little sliver of space, makes part of this vertical sequence of ground, of the viaduct, very unusual raising of a roadway in New York, of the kind of datum lines, of some setbacks of buildings adjacent at 125 Park. So it's, again, a tiny bit of Moses King's vertical New York brought into a semi-public space in a high-rise building. And there is a Daniel Boulud restaurant, which we designed the interior wall and of course the ceiling and so on, a soaring space, and one which is works to grow trees, and there's a lofty quality to it as it's seen from inside or outside. So the building was finished, I think September 23rd this last year. So still wearing masks at that point. You see the mayor, before Mayor Adams assumed his role before the election, I believe, Mark Holliday in the middle next to Mayor de Blasio. And then the sort of coda to the building and to this talk was a piece of the design and a piece of building construction that happened at the very top of the building. So at the base, as we come from Grand Central, we might look up and see the fresco of the constellation of the heavens. It's actually backwards because whoever was reading this, the plan of the skies, read it from top down. It should have been seen from bottom up, but still we see Orion belt, the crab, etc. So a picture of the heavens. But then when we go through the passageway at the level of the information booth, towards what was the Rite Aid. And then as one comes to an elevator, it takes one to the top of the building. And at the top, one emerges into a double, triple, quadruple height series of spaces that bring a kind of glory of a view of the city to those who either live in New York, visit New York. This is the design of an artist, a man named Kenzo, who worked very closely with Mark Holliday to kind of dream up an idea that the reflections of the sky and the city could come together in this almost infinite way. And, the tops of our buildings in New York, we think of not as private places, not as the home for the richest person in whichever part of the world, but as something that really belongs to the public. It's a very important principle in the planning of London, where Peter Rees said the top of London will not be occupied by a 50 million pound apartment. It's something we are going to leave for Londoners. So back to New York, this is the case in this really unusual and inspiring piece of which we had nothing to do. We made the core and the shell and the space, and just from the initial competition said we hope this will be a crystalline open form for the top of the building. But what has been done was realizing what we couldn't imagine but would have hoped for. And so we finished just by saying that the tower is a piece of architecture like this is never everything you think it should be. Architecture is a very imperfect kind of practice. It's the art of compromise, but we can say that those people who either worked in teams of engineering or city planning or of financial deal making and development, and ultimately of a mayor and a developer, did something that we can be quite proud of. And on a final note, just to dwell on this image for a moment, the upcoming set of possibilities that we expect will come to the Penn Station area. Maybe not immediately, where it's hard to tell when the master plans that Amtrak has launched or that others in various city and state organs will and may make happen at Penn Station. But it is the place where transit-oriented density will bring something great to New York, something we really very badly want after the erasure of the McKim and White building in 1965 or so. This we think stands as a kind of a signal that, and a reminder that if the right conditions can be made, the collaboration between public and private, which we might even look back to Gramercy Park and think of it as a small example of how public and private work together, but it can yield great things in the city, and take that as a set of professionals and those who work in the commerce and the culture of various parts of New York. Really hope that Penn Station, that there will be a great lecture given by some architect, planner, developer, in 10 years about the transformation of that district. So thank you very much, and really happy to take my screen off or turn off my screen and answer questions. Here we are.
Thank you very much, James. That was amazing. And the historical aspect of it was excellent. I really enjoyed seeing that, taking it back to the original Manhattan plan and then going through the grid and making all the comparisons. Thank you very much. We do have some questions, so we'll just jump right into them. So is the building open to the public, the top floor? Can people go to the top floor and see the view?
Yeah, it's open to the public. You have to pay. Not every day. There are some open days and days for school kids and their programs to allow those who don't pay to go to the top. But otherwise, it is a source of revenue. So I don't know exactly what the cost is, maybe $30, but it is open to the public, and you know, a good place to one of our staff members proposed to his fiancée there already. So I think it's working.
It really is a fantastic looking space. Way to go. Yeah. I think it is different from a sort of like just an outward impact or something like that. Certainly different from a £50 million penthouse. Though I can imagine somebody spending £50 million to get a penthouse that looks like that. All right, next question. How do you respond to people who have concern about changing a historic New York City skyline with the addition of Supercalls?
Yeah, I think so. Always legitimate question. Everybody, we should all ask for very, very large buildings if they're put in the right place, if they perform the right function, if they help our cities. And I think tall buildings don't belong everywhere. There are tall buildings that throw shadows on parks, that block views, or that congest unnecessarily. At the same time, New York City is a city of tall buildings. And we, or the Chicagoans, whichever wins the argument, invented the tall building, and we are a high-rise city, and we thrive on the kind of hustle and bustle that's brought by the dense occupancy, dense buildings, well managed. So I think I don't want to try to be the judge of my own work, but I think that there was a lot, as I try to explain, of effort put into paying homage to Grand Central, which I think is one of the greatest buildings in New York by number of measures. And then there is the matter of the skyline, which one could say, well, that's public because it's a kind of it's a face. Is it my face, your face? No, it's all of ours. It is the face of our city in profile. And I think the point tower is something which is a very particular and special expression. There are plenty of buildings with flat tops, and the point towers are, a handful. Chrysler, of course, Empire State, Bank of America, and some other not quite as tall Newsweek and other buildings. And what we tried to do is to make a top which would be elegant and have a kind of aspiring character to reach for the heavens, but to pose in that role. If you could say that a high-rise building is sort of an actor on a stage, the role of that site is so much a singular one, of the connector to, it's like the navel, the whatever you want to call it, the umphalos of New York City, that I think it called for a strong statement of architectural form. So, good question.
Yeah, I think also, well, I think New York City kind of has its history, it's like you said, it's a city of the skyline changing. So it's appropriate that the skyline changes. I think that's really, when you say historic New York City skyline, it's constantly changing. I think maybe the question might not be exactly what he was asking, but Supercalls, I think, sort of refer to this sort of slenderness ratio that we're seeing over more on the park, right? And I don't know where all of a sudden what proportions make a super tall. But do you have any thoughts about super talls themselves, this sort of idea of the super slender, super tall building?
Yeah, I think, the super tall redefines itself as we get to higher and higher reaches, and technology allows with new forms of elevatoring and efficient ways to build core structures, et cetera. But I think and there's a point at which a tall building doesn't quite make sense functionally or economically in the margins of the extra floors and heights. And that might be around the height of this building. Our firm is responsible for the design of, I think, 6 of the 11 tallest buildings standing in the world today. But I think to want to or need to or justify the building of a very, very tall building has to be a really good reason. Again, it has a lot to do with location, but I think you mentioned something about proportion. Not every tall building is an elegant tall building, and I maybe shouldn't comment on this one. Again, it's sort of like, you look in the mirror and you see yourself, so you go, "Oh, I look pretty good today." But there are tall buildings. There, for example, I won't name names. There's a building in a great city in the United Kingdom, which is a big blocker of view, space, and light. And I think there are cases where buildings that are too big, too broad, too massive have been put forever, or as long as buildings will stand, in the middle of our cities. And I mentioned the sort of slimming of this building by the device of 4 nested volumes, and that was distinctly done to give almost a reed-like thinness to the appearance of the building. Not everything in architecture obviously is about appearance. Buildings are performative. They have carbon footprint issues. They're functional, but appearance is a kind of in the central place of a major location city. It is a kind of a function, and so I think we really have to watch out not to put big commodity objects of real estate, success, where sometimes architecture hasn't been given enough running room or room to do what I think as architects we believe in. So I can credit this client for being not just SL Green, but Hines, who developed the building along with, as very experienced high-rise developers who understand there's more than the sale and the leasing of a floor plate in the making of such a building. We have long-term commitments to our cities as designers and builders and citizens.
It's a good point. You can do it in a conscientious way. But the next question is related. The building is quite tall. Is there many new residence buildings on 57th Street? What restrictions, if any, are applicable to new structures, and how, if at all, are they coordinated with one another? Is there any attempt to create a harmonious skyline?
Really interesting question, because the answer changes over time, and certainly, city to city. New York allows, by and large, with zoning, and this, by the way, I didn't go into it, but this building was not what we call an as-of-right building. The building was a special permit, or ULURP, Universal Land Use Review Process building. And so the zoning rules that have to do with setbacks and light lines of light penetration did not apply to this building. It was judged to be an important enough benefit, the buildings, realizing the building, for the city to say, go ahead and do something denser. But New York City has the ability to, in a way, curate the skyline in that way. And I think the planners of New York, they may not shape the skyline as actively, let's say, as the planners of the City of London. And I mentioned Peter Rees earlier as the planner of much of what we see today as the new tall center of London. And there's a kind of respect in New York for the marketplace. So that balance between what should be regulated by those people who we elect and ask to safeguard our city, and the freedom of the market is very much, if it tips in the wrong balance, our city doesn't work for the interest of its citizens. And so, that's, I think, going forward, a big question, whether the tallest buildings by parks are a good idea. Should we look at, in the future, at the social and sustainable utility or sensitivity of buildings before allowing buildings that are that tall to go up? I think there is such a thing as building too much, too tall. We shouldn't say that we're a high-rise city, anything goes, the sky is wonderful, penetrate the clouds. But I think this building was done with a lot of thinking and measuring of those issues. Going forward, I think we may come into what some people call a performative zoning. Zoning isn't something that's changed over time. 1916 was one set of rules, 1961 another. Zoning has evolved. And we may come to the point where, and I think we should, where a taller building allowed should be asked to provide more social, cultural, or other space. The issues of access and equity and bringing the population into the city, which I believe the Vanderbilt project does, because a lot of it is about public transit. But let's say it were just a palace for wealthy people, I don't think it would have been the right building in that place.
Yeah, that leads into more questions about accessibility. We got a bunch of those. Do you know, is that third floor terrace you showed, the sliver, is that open to the public?
It's not. It's open to the building public. In other words, if you rent space there, you use that space. It was designed with the idea that someday it might be a public space. That it would work beautifully as a public space. You know, you go to the station, but before you get on your train, you go to have a drink or see a friend. And I think we have to remember that functions in buildings can change, and the fullness of time, who knows, that might happen. I think for good reason. I mean, the building needs to be a financially solvent proposition. And in the depths of the COVID period, now we're facing a world at odds with itself, with geopolitics that are so scary, and energy prices, inflation, and so it's a good thing that Vanderbilt building leased and that it didn't open up as a flop. That third floor is a big reason why the building leased for over 90% when it opened. So, I don't want to be only an apologist for private enterprise, but the idea, just to answer the question, is an architect doesn't write the program for all of the kind of use rules, especially the commercial use rules of the building. But the third floor is there. It's a piece of New York. I would like someday it to be seen as a place that every New Yorker can experience.
Wonderful. Right. There was another question about accessibility. I'll get to that in a minute. Does the building use LED technology?
Yes, in its interior lighting, because the efficiency of LED is such a huge quantum leap forward in the world, in the electrical use. And I can't fish the statistics out of my head, but the U.S. practice of basically, use of electricity through lighting has become much more efficient, we know, in the last 15 years. So yeah, LED is a big part of that. And, it's a very important movement in architecture. And this building is a little bit at the cusp of that. Other buildings like the World Trade Center 5 building, which we're designing now downtown with for Brookfield and Silverstein developers, will be an all electric or electrifiable residential building, meaning that, when the grid improves through more renewable resource engines of solar and tidal and wind, et cetera, that buildings can plug into that grid and become much more advanced in their energy saving and reduction of carbon footprint. So that's something I think we want to proselytize about for future buildings. Vanderbilt does its best with the practices of its time, which was now 10 years ago.
I haven't heard about caring for the electric part, but that makes sense. A lot of our projects were basically doing all electrical appliances in the units just for sustainability and healthy living reasons. But it gets into some discussions when it comes to heating, water, and that sort of thing. Another question was about, do you use modern environmentally friendly HVAC?
Yes, and others are really better qualified to talk about the air filtration, delivery, and the direct outdoor air systems, which are not as thoroughgoing again in this building, the DOAS, I believe, as today's buildings would be if they were started today. But I don't want to talk outside my area, and that's JB&B, top engineering firm of ventilation. Of course, as the building was being delivered, the filtration of air and health and microbes and viruses, that became the most important thing on our minds. So a lot of work was put into that.
While we're on this subject, before I get into the accessibility, could you list the top 3 sustainable measures that the developer took in building design beyond LEED standard per se?
Yeah, I would say the most important would be a macro issue of the location of the building and the connecting to public transit. I mean, it's not a technique, it's a macro strategy, but it's choice that's made by the city and by the developer, and obviating the need for more taxis and more transport from A to B by arriving right at the place, and reinforcing the center is super, super important. We know various American and other global cities where transit is not connected to density, and sprawl creates these kind of intractable problems in the structure of a city of environmentally retrograde solutions. Other than that, the sustainable measures have more to do with glass coatings, with efficiency in structure, embedded materials. It's a steel building, which is better than a concrete building. I'm not saying that's unusual in New York. Most office buildings are steel, concrete being the carbon hog of materials. Beautiful building material, but not the smartest, at least in traditional concrete work. But the Tekla modeling, which Severud and Thornton Tomasetti brought to the project, which allowed for a kind of a full optimizing of the efficiency of the structure, is also a big contributor to the carbon efficiency of the building. So I would say probably the glass, the structure, and the urban transit-oriented, transit-connected equation.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's an easy slam dunk, right? All right. The accessibility question was building connections between the buildings linked, the accessibility, ramps or elevators.
Well, the building is fully accessible for handicap, if that's the issue. By common practice, really. And I think the ADA, American Disabilities Act, which is enforced not by public prosecution, but by private cases mostly, has really changed our country. There's nothing exceptional or unusual about Vanderbilt as a project, but I think the rule, the kind of iron rule that you will not have a major use unless any American, with whatever level of ability, can come and use it, is just part of our public practice, practice of architecture and licensing of our work. So that's something that didn't exist 30 years ago. But again, I won't pretend that Vanderbilt is special in that way. It's just good practice. I think of it, we encounter interesting issues. There are several kind of daring activities that might happen at the top of the building, and we have to ask ourselves if there is, some kind of bungee jump or something. We don't know what that might be, but they exist in tall towers. Is that right? If not everybody could do so, and that's really, I think, for the public in a way to decide. But I think there's a humanity to the American practice. I won't pretend it's perfect, and have friends who work to try to make a difference in changing some of the ways in which our city is not friendly to everybody. But I think there are many dimensions which we can improve that are outside this particular focus of the super tall.
Sounds good. I've got a really interesting one here. Is it true that the construction and internal management from SL Green was headed by a former military sergeant?
By a former which sergeant?
Military sergeant. It says sergeant military,
Well,
but I assume.
Well, yes, I mean, yes, but I'm not sure which one you mean, because yeah, there are several members of SL Green. One, was a Navy SEAL. He wasn't the head of the company, but a big contributor. Another I always think of as a kind of military leader, because I think he was in charge of some aspect of security of some of the tallest buildings. In fact, he had some role in the World Trade Center before it fell, sadly. But yeah, there's an aspect of organization of such an effort to put up a building like this that is really, you shouldn't just leave it to the architects, to those with the soft pencils. Not that we don't have our disciplines of serious management. We do. My partner Nick Dunn is a really, really skilled leader of the regimented process. But SL Green does have the side of the kind of creative financiers. It also has a side of kind of seriously almost military delivery. But we're talking about tens of thousands of people who work on these buildings, and the factors of safety and getting the job done require supreme organization. And New York is, on the whole, our building culture and the culture of companies, not too many of them like SL Green, but there are a few, and contractors like Tishman, their standards, and companies like Hines. They're very, very serious about when they need to be strict about a schedule, a protocol, a practice. And the fact that they can do so and still allow us architects in the part of our work that has to be a little bit free thinking to sketch and imagine things is, it's I think in New York, the profession works pretty well in that manner.
Great. Yeah. One thing though, we were talking before this about a heroic move you made at the bottom of the building to open it up to Grand Central, but I think the real heroes that build it, they really do the hard work. Right. Other than the observatory, what aspect of the design did the developer affect most?
Good question. Observatory, certainly. I think the developer sort of walked along the path with us every step of the way. And, there is a kind of a tennis game. The ball goes back and forth, and you're not sure if an idea is going to stick until you test it in the kind of, there's a dialogue. And I think, for a large building practice, it's hard in many cases to say, who's the author of the idea. Well, we gave it a figure, but the best ideas have many fathers, and then the bad ones are orphans. So I think we can say that this tower, the developer had ideas or embraced early on ideas about tapering. Also steered us away from some ideas that weren't very good, like curving the tower. Mark said, New York City is a grid. You don't violate the kind of DNA of the city as you make a form that you think might be expressive or deliver great views, but it won't be a New York building anymore. So I think it's that kind of conversation that you have with people you trust about issues that are important to you. If architecture matters, it does. It's not life and death. It's not like some of the discussions we have today about war in Ukraine and matters of ultimate, total consequence. But still, I think they are important issues. And so other issues which the developer brought to the table probably also had to do with the the public nature of spaces at the base and working with the transit authorities. After all, they have long-term relationships with MTA, with Metro North. I mean, they're there. SL Green owns a lot of the territory around Grand Central. So these are their regular partners. So it's in that discussion that they played a really critical role in steering the public-private conversation. And, you know, those are the sort of stories that in bigger vistas, you know, you can see, we see in Robert Caro's book on Robert Moses, or, you know, that sort of thing. But I think in a way, SL Green plays that role. A fellow named Rob Schiffer, who you know, had every consequential conversation with planners and public officials. You know, architecture is not a private art. It's a public kind of a process of debate and compromise and joining together. And so, you know, I'm not saying this to pander because it's true. You know, good development happens with a lot of hard work from people like that.
Wonderful. So now an interesting question. Were there any architectural missteps that your team made early on that you recovered from, and how did you manage the recovery?
Yeah, I think, you know, there's sometimes in anything you do in life, and maybe in the work that you hope you're proud of, you ask, could you have done better? What mistake did you make? Or, you know, what did you recover from? I think we did make some mistakes. We made the building too tall at one point. It assumed a form that was inflated by maybe 200 feet, 300 feet. You know, there's a little bit of the glory of the tall building you imagine. Taller might be better. But it took a kind of a very rational, critical eye of some of our colleagues who were also more on the development side. A developer with Hines, the leader of the New York office, Tommy Craig, to examine, you know, let's not just do something without asking if you push it down, what happens? Push it down more, what happens? Then we pushed it down too far and then it popped up a bit, but it's a better building for not being another couple hundred feet taller, because that would have been a space hog. It would have been a skyline, you know, too much of a skyline scratcher, and would have cost too much. So efficiency is not just a matter of the bottom line. It's also a matter of, you know, engineers will tell you the most successful engineering designs are elegant designs. They're elegant in their efficiency. And I think that was one mistake we would have made, were prevented from making.
Wonderful. Great answer. I thought that might be a hard question. We're over on time, so is it okay to answer a couple more questions?
Absolutely. I'm very, very happy to continue.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but your timing on your presentation was perfect. So we're now just squeezing some more questions out of you, and I apologize, but this is an opportunity to pass up. There was a good question here. From my apartment window, I see an elevator going up and down from the top floors. What floors does it cover?
That elevator is part of the observation deck experience. So the ob deck, as we might call it, which is this, what you saw in that room full of mirrors and their ancillary spaces, was something that, in a kind of general sense, as I mentioned, we imagined to be occupy the top of the building, but it wasn't fully fleshed out until the building was approaching its you know, realization as a structure, and then the idea became, it gained momentum to make a piece of the building that would be quite specifically, you know, have a certain thematic experience of you know, mirrors and clouds and so on, and so the sort of, you know, how do you make a thrilling experience even more thrilling got examined this way and the other. Should we have a cantilever diving board where you can tie yourself in? So in the end, a set of glass elevators on the outside that come up and down So you're sort of perched with a glass floor looking down 1,400 feet is a sort of an element of thrill. That's part of that observation deck. There are also little kind of cantilever diving board like ledges that happen on the west side. So when these were first put into drawing and then built, we architects wondered, aren't you going to ruin the crystalline shape of a simple, smooth treatment of the top of the building? Indeed, it is not a regular and kind of a continuous form. It's an event at the top. And my first, I have to admit, my first reaction was that something was, there was a kind of a mistake made at the top of the building. But then over time, I started to understand, and then spending time inside this space, that this is one of the few high-rise buildings which has a programmatic activity, something special happening at the top of the tower that you can actually see. It broadcasts its identity and the particularity of what happens inside. And that's a pretty cool thing to be able to do. For a building not to be just the kind of pristine object, but to have a visual meaning. And so that's a long answer to explain why those little elevators are there and what they're part of, and how we see it as part of the total architecture of the building.
Wonderful. All right, that will lead into our final question. The lighting of the current building is absolutely spectacular. It's subtle and almost lantern-like. Was that your intent? Was there ever a discussion of a different lighting scheme, or was this always the plan?
Yeah, lighting is surprisingly important in any building, because our eyes are only as appreciative of things as we can see them, and much of the day we don't see. In the night we don't see things without lighting. So I mean, that's obvious, but a lot of people, even in our own apartments or houses, we don't think enough about how important lighting is. And lighting is a very tricky discipline. It's hard to predict, only with not just calculation, but some certain wisdom of experience. The lighting designers understand the effects of light, not just the amount, but the direction, the temperature of light. So in making the light for the top of the building, if that's the question, is more about the top.
Yeah, there was another question about the overall lighting. So
Well, the top is a big part of it, but what we did over a period of about 8 months was to go with our lighting designers, Suzanne Tillotson and Mark Holliday, the chief CEO of SL Green, and to go to different points in the city. We had to wait for the weather was good, so it would take a while to line these up, and have engineers in the building go through routines of light settings that would change, 20 settings, and then comment on them and basically, telephone over, change the temperature from 1300 to 1600. And then the whole thing would glow. We wondered what people on the street were wondering, because the tower was kind of moving around its lighting settings. But it's very interesting when you analyze the light temperature of Empire State Building is very warm. It's one of the reasons we love it. Others are cooler, looking more like a refrigerator light. So a lot of attention was paid to this. And in the process, as is more possible these days, that we determined that the lighting would be completely adjustable in its color and its intensity. So the setting right now is a kind of classic setting that we think is classic for the building, but on holidays it would change color. And then over time, we could vary the intensity of it. So, but it was a subject of a lot of scrutiny, and it's expensive too, to light something that big in a way that can be appreciated from afar. So I'd say there's always room for improvement, and the kind of tuning and tempering of the light is still happening, but a lot of care was put into it.
Oh, interesting. It goes on past opening. Yeah, amazing. All right, well, we are well over time, and I thank you immensely for doing this program from Munich, from Germany. I'm sure it's very late there now, that it's later at night. So when you come back to New York City. We'd be happy to have you. And on behalf of the National Hearts Club, Guten Nacht.
Yeah, good enough. Thank you, everybody. Really enjoyed this, and be happy to, if people come to the site and want to see the top of the building, I'd be happy to assist. And all the best to the National Arts Club. It's a great place, and love your program. So thank you again.
You're welcome anytime, Jamie.